Good morning. Thank you for joining me today. This morning we'll be in Numbers, chapter 8, verse 1 through chapter 9, verse 23. The Lord spoke to Moses. Speak to Aaron and tell him, when you set up the lamps, the 7 lamps are to give light in front of the lampstand. And Aaron did so. He set up the lamps to face toward the front of the lampstand, as the Lord commanded Moses. This is how the lampstand was made. It was beaten work in gold, from its shaft to its flowers. It was beaten work, according to the pattern which the Lord had shown Moses. So he made the lampstand. Then the Lord spoke to Moses, Take the Levites from among the Israelites, and purify them, and do this to them to purify them. Sprinkle water of purification on them, then have them shave all their body, and wash their clothes, and so purify themselves. Then they are to take a young bull with its grain offering of fine flour mixed with olive oil, and you are to take a second young bull for a purification offering. You are to bring the Levites before the tent of meeting, and assemble the entire community of the Israelites. Then you are to bring the Levites before the Lord, and the Israelites are to lay their hands on the Levites. And Aaron is to offer the Levites before the Lord as a wave offering from the Israelites, that they may do the work of the Lord. When the Levites lay their hands on the heads of the bulls, offer the one for a purification offering, and the other for a whole burnt offering to the Lord, to make atonement for the Levites. You are to have the Levites stand before Aaron and his sons, and then offer them as a wave offering to the Lord. And so you are to separate the Levites from among the Israelites, and the Levites will be mine. After this, the Levites will go in to do the work of the tent of meeting. So you must cleanse them and offer them like a wave offering. For they are entirely given to me from among the Israelites. I have taken them for myself, instead of all who open the womb, the firstborn sons of all the Israelites. For all the firstborn males among the Israelites are mine, both humans and animals. When I destroyed all the firstborn in the land of Egypt, I set them apart for myself. So I have taken the Levites instead of all the firstborn sons among the Israelites. I have given the Levites as a gift to Aaron and his sons from among the Israelites, to do the work for the Israelites in the tent of meeting, and to make atonement for the Israelites. So there will be no plague among the Israelites when the Israelites come near the sanctuary. So Moses and Aaron and the entire community of the Israelites did this with the Levites, according to all that the Lord commanded Moses concerning the Levites. This is what the Israelites did with them. The Levites purified themselves and washed their clothing. Then Aaron presented them like a wave offering before the Lord, and Aaron made atonement for them to purify them. After this, the Levites went in to do their work in the tent of meeting before Aaron and before his sons, as the Lord had commanded Moses concerning the Levites, so they did. Then the Lord spoke to Moses. This is what pertains to the Levites. At the age of 25 years and upward, one may begin to join the company in the work of the tent of meeting. And at the age of 50 years, they must retire from performing the work and may no longer work. They may assist their colleagues in the tent of meeting to attend to needs, but they must do no work. This is the way you must establish the Levites regarding their duties. The Lord spoke to Moses in the wilderness of Sinai, in the first month of the second year after they had come out of the land of Egypt. The Israelites are to observe the Passover at its appointed time. In the 14th day of this month at twilight, you are to observe it at its appointed time. You must keep it in accordance with all its statutes and all its customs. So Moses instructed the Israelites to observe the Passover, and they observed the Passover on the 14th day of the first month at twilight in the wilderness of Sinai. In accordance with all that the Lord had commanded Moses, so the Israelites did. It happened that some men who were ceremonially defiled by the dead body of a man could not keep the Passover on that day, so they came before Moses and before Aaron on that day. And those men said to him, We are ceremonially defiled by the dead body of a man. Why are we kept back from offering the Lord's offering at its appointed time among the Israelites? So Moses said to them, Remain here, and I will hear what the Lord will command concerning you. The Lord spoke to Moses, Tell the Israelites, if any of you or of your posterity become ceremonially defiled by touching a dead body, or are on a journey far away, then he may observe the Passover to the Lord. They may observe it on the 14th day of the second month at twilight. They are to eat with bread made without yeast with bitter herbs. They must not leave any of it until morning, nor break any of its bones. They must observe it in accordance with every statute of the Passover. But the man who was ceremonially clean, and was not on a journey, and fails to keep the Passover, that person must be cut off from his people, because he did not bring the Lord's offering at its appointed time. That man must bear his sin. If a resident foreigner lives among you and wants to keep the Passover to the Lord, he must do so according to the statute of the Passover, and according to its custom. You must have the same statute for the resident foreigner and for the one who was born in the land. On that day the tabernacle was set up. The cloud covered the tabernacle, the tent of the testimony, and from evening until morning there was a fiery appearance over the tabernacle. This is the way it used to be continually. The cloud would cover it by day, and there was a fiery appearance by night. Whenever the cloud was taken up from the tabernacle, then after that the Israelites would begin their journey, and in whatever place the cloud settled, there the Israelites would make camp. At the commandment of the Lord the Israelites would begin the journey, and at the commandment of the Lord they would make camp. As long as the cloud remained settled over the tabernacle, they would camp. When the cloud remained over the tabernacle many days, then the Israelites obeyed the instructions of the Lord and did not journey. When the cloud remained over the tabernacle a number of days, they remained camped according to the Lord's commandment, and according to the Lord's commandment they would journey. And when the cloud remained only from evening until morning, when the cloud was taken up the following morning, then they traveled on, whether by day or by night. When the cloud was taken up, they traveled. Whether it was for 2 days, or a month, or a year, that the cloud prolonged its stay over the tabernacle, the Israelites remained camped without traveling. But when it was taken up, they traveled on. At the commandment of the Lord they camped, and at the commandment of the Lord they traveled on. They kept the instructions of the Lord according to the commandment of the Lord by the authority of Moses. Interesting that you have such repetition there concerning this concept of them only leaving camp when the Lord commanded. Because recalling what was said about the Israelites earlier, they weren't exactly super faithful in the wilderness with bringing along their god Moloch and Rumpha. So, yeah. Yeah, so you have the 7 lamps that Aaron was to arrange in a specific way. The cleansing of the Levites. The years of service that a Levite may perform, that is from 25 years and upward to 50 years. They must retire from performing the work and may no longer work. Then concerning the Passover, and then the cloud over the tabernacle. Let's see what Guzik has to say here. When you arrange the lamps. The lampstand was described and made in Exodus 25:31-40, but the lampstand by itself could give no light. It had to have lamps placed upon it that made the light. The purpose of the lampstand was not to make light, but to make the light more visible. The lamps burned a specially made olive oil and needed to be continually filled with oil to provide constant light. A candlestick or lamp without oil is of no use. Oil not burning is of no use. So a church or society of religious people without the influence of the Holy Ghost are dead while they have a name to live. Revelation 1:20 presents lampstands as a picture of the church, the new covenant community of God's people. By this illustration, we see the principle that the church itself does not light the world, but it does provide a platform for the light of Jesus to be seen. That which elevates Christ to make him shown. He arranged the lamps to face toward the front of the lampstand. The light from the lampstand in the tabernacle was focused to bring the most illumination to the rest of the tent, especially for the table of showbread in front of the lampstand, and the altar of incense to the left of the lampstand. In this way, there would always be light on the bread. The twin symbols of life would work together to speak of the life-giving mercies of the Lord, whose attention is ever on his people. Yeah. Guidance and sustenance. Upon that table the light from the golden lampstand ever fell. Thus were typified the great principles of the life of fellowship with God, which have their fulfillment for us in Christ. We have a table of communion, but it is well to remember that upon it the light is ever shining. We only have right to that table as we dwell in that light. The lampstand was hammered gold. The lampstand was hammered out of pure gold, with no specific dimensions given, but after the pattern of a modern-day menorah. It had one middle shaft with 3 branches coming out of each side, for a total of 7 places for lamps. Many items in the tabernacle were made of wood and covered with gold, such as the Ark of the Covenant, the altar of incense, and the table of showbread. The lampstand was different, made out of solid gold. Not hollow, but solid and massive gold, beaten out of one piece, and not of several pieces joined or soldered together. John Trapp commented on the King James Version translation, beaten gold, to show that ministers must beat their brains to beat out the sense of the scriptures, as the fowl beats the shell to get out the fish with great vehemency. Yeah. A work that must be pursued with persistence. Take the Levites from among the children of Israel and cleanse them ceremonially. The record of the dedication of the priests is in Leviticus 8 and 9. This is the record of the dedication of the Levites. The Levites did not offer sacrifices for atonement, dedication, or fellowship with God, as the priests did, but their service to God was nevertheless valued and important. Their work of practical service also required dedication and consecration to the Lord. Sorry. Yeah, the Levites are helpers to the priests, and the language describing their consecration is somewhat distinct from that of the priests. The priests were made holy, the Levites clean. The priests were anointed and washed, the Levites sprinkled. The priests were given new garments, the Levites washed theirs. Blood was applied to the priests, it was waved over the Levites. Interesting. Let them shave all their body. The shaving of the Levites as part of their consecration was mainly a symbol of their purification, as the cleansed bodies of lepers was shaved. In consecration, as Nazarites' heads were shaved at the end of their vow. Yet the Levites were also given to God from Israel as their firstborn. God received the tribe of Levi instead of each individual firstborn boy from Israel. Newborn babies are relatively free from hair, and this also corresponds with the shaving of the Levites in their dedication to God. According to all that the Lord commanded. This was simple, wonderful obedience. God told Moses and the children of Israel to perform these dedication rituals for the Levites, and they did them just as God commanded. From 25 years old and above. A Levite's time of active service was to begin at age 30 and last until 50, according to Numbers 4, verse 3, 423, and 430. Yet their formal training began at age 25 with a 5-year apprenticeship. And at the age of 50 years, they must cease performing the work. Since much of the work of the Levites involved hard physical labor, It was from this work that they must cease when they turned 50, allowing the younger men to bear the burden. There were other things that they could continue to do after 50, minister with their brethren in the tabernacle. They would no longer dismantle and transport the tabernacle and its furnishing, but they could continue to serve as guards, ensuring the sanctity of the holy place. Thus you shall do to the Levites regarding their duties. Moses, the children of Israel, and the Levites all did as God directed them. The Levites showed the qualities of the kind of people ready to inherit the promised land, those who are cleansed, dedicated, and doing the work. And then the Passover. Let the children of Israel keep the Passover at its appointed time. It was not a surprise for Israel to hear that Passover must be kept every year. When Passover was first instituted, God told Israel they were to keep it throughout their generations. Passover reminded Israel of when God passed over his people, when Egypt's firstborn were judged in the last plague upon Egypt. The blood of the lamb applied to the doorposts of the home was seen by the angel of God's judgment, and seeing the blood, the angel passed over and spared the home covered by the blood of a lamb. Passover was kept as a continual reminder of this occasion of judgment passed over, and of the deliverance from slavery that followed. Jesus fulfilled the Passover sacrifice by his death on the cross. The covering of his blood caused the judgment of God to pass over his people. We are commanded to continually remember our occasion of being spared judgment and the deliverance that followed by remembering Jesus' work on the cross. So the children of Israel did. Israel was properly obedient to God. We don't find any significant disobedience against God, of distrust of him, or on Israel's part, in the first 10 chapters of Numbers while they camped at Mount Sinai. This makes their distrust of God and rebellion against him even more shocking and without excuse from Numbers 11 on. It seems they started decently well. But there were certain men who were defiled by a human corpse, so that they could not keep the Passover. This was an attempt to resolve two principles. The first principle was that every Israelite must be included in the Passover. The second principle was that no one in a state of ritual uncleanness could take part in the normal religious life of the community. These certain men were probably not the only ones in Israel who had defiled themselves right before Passover. These men wanted to keep the Passover and were bold enough to ask Moses, and to ask God through Moses for an exception to the previous command. Yeah. Yeah. This also, I think, stands as an instance of dismissing the standard narrative of Moses received everything from God up on the mountain and didn't have to go in again. That is, that he also received the oral Torah to perfectly interpret the law. But here we have him having to ask God again for jurisprudence concerning this instance where someone was defiled and still wanted to keep the Passover. And he may still keep the Lord's Passover. God told Moses that those unclean at Passover could still keep the feast, but they must do it 1 month later, on the 14th day of the second month. This solution made keeping of Passover possible, yet it respected God's holiness and the principles of ritual purity. Historically, the application of the second month alternative Passover occurred during the reign of Hezekiah in 2 Chronicles 30, 1 through 27. The punishment for not keeping Passover was severe. That man shall bear his sin, instead of having their sin borne by the Passover lamb. In the same way, we must partake of Jesus, or we will bear our own sin. Jesus said, "Most assuredly I say to you, unless you eat the flesh of the Son of Man and drink his blood, you have no life in you. He who eats my flesh and drinks my blood abides in me, and I in him." Yeah. Yeah, and Jesus essentially says, too, that the Passover is about him. Do this as often as you drink it in remembrance of me, type thing. And if a stranger dwells among you. Additionally, it didn't matter what bloodline or ethnic group the person came from. Even the stranger among Israel could and must keep the Passover, or they would be cut off. A Jew with the purest bloodlines would be cut off if they neglected Passover, and a Gentile stranger would be accepted if they kept God's Passover. The inclusion of the alien in covenantal legislation such as this reminds us of God's great grace, and also of his determined purpose to reach out through his people to all peoples. He must do according to the rite of Passover and according to its ceremony. The second Passover had to be kept according to the same rite and ceremony as the normal feast. The meal and the ritual had to be the same. Rabbi Gamaliel, the teacher of Saul, is quoted as saying that if anyone does not eat the lamb, the unleavened bread, and the bitter herbs, he has not kept the Passover. He built his words on verse 11. This command suggests 3 points to Charles Spurgeon. Spiritually speaking, we are to feed upon Jesus Christ. We are to feed upon the whole of Christ, all his person, all his offices, all his teachings, all his warnings, all his commands, all his work. We receive Christ in community, in union with others. Now on the day that the tabernacle was raised up, when the tabernacle was originally built, God blessed it by showing his presence in the form of the cloud by day and the fire by night. The cloud covered the tabernacle. This cloud of God's Shekinah glory was evident at different times in Israel's history. For example, when Solomon built the temple, the cloud of glory filled the temple. When Israel had completely turned away from God, and before the temple was destroyed by conquering Babylonians, the cloud of glory departed. Yeah, and the same cloud of glory is what the Son of Man comes riding in on the clouds of heaven in Daniel. From evening until morning it was above the tabernacle like the appearance of fire. These signs were more than the visible assurance of God's presence. The cloud by day and the fire by night were also helps and comforts to Israel. The fire at night was a comfort to Israel amid a dark wilderness, and the cloud by day was a shade from the hot wilderness sun. The idea of God's presence as a protective shade is repeated in other places. For you have been a strength to the poor, a strength to the needy in his distress, a refuge from the storm, a shade from the heat. In Isaiah 25:4. So it was always. Though Israel had been organized and ordered by God, though they had been cleansed, set apart, blessed, giving, and walking in their priesthood, they still had to be guided by God each step of the way to make it to the promised land of Canaan. God did not do all those previous things to make them able to march toward the promised land without him, but to make every step in constant dependence on him. Always, the text suggests the permanent abiding of the cloud over the camp in the words, "This is how it continued to be." Whenever the cloud was taken up above the tabernacle, after that the children of Israel would journey. When the cloud moved, Israel moved. When the cloud stayed, Israel stayed. They only went where the presence of God led them, and they only stayed where the presence of God stayed. These were symbols one could not ignore. They were awesome and eerie, unnatural and unexpected, comforting and protective. To relieve the heat of the desert sun, there was a cloud by day. To reverse the cold darkness of the desert night, there was a comforting fire overhead. In a similar way, believers must be led by the presence of God. Colossians 3:15 says, "Let the peace of God rule in your hearts." This means to let the presence of God's peace be an umpire or a judge in our heart and life. Whether it was 2 days, a month, or a year, the movement of the cloud was unpredictable. God would not allow Israel to be led by routine or tradition. They had to see and respond to the presence of God. The thrice repeated refrain sums it up. At the command of the Lord they encamped, and at the command of the Lord they set out. The cloud hovering over the tabernacle provided the perfect means of divine guidance. The people had to respond with perfect obedience. No responsibility rested on the people save that of obedience. They were not called on to consider the time or direction of their march, but it was equally true they were not permitted to object or delay, all of which served to keep the fact of the sovereign authority of Jehovah perpetually before them. For Morgan. God chose to keep his people so dependent upon himself and so submissive to the decisions of his own will that he would not even give them regular times of marching or resting. They were to do both when and where God saw best. From Clark. Yeah, and from McLaren here. We need to hold the present with a slack hand, so as to be ready to fold our tents and take to the road. If God will, we must not reckon on continuance, nor strike our roots so deep that it needs a hurricane to remove us. Yeah, we should be ready to move by the direction of God. Anywho, thank you so much for joining me today. I hope you have a great day. Bye.